In my last podcast, hopefully I persuaded you for your winery, your target customer is not a retail store. It's not the distributor. It's actually the person who drinks the wine. A lot of small wineries get caught up in thinking that the distributor is the customer. And it is if you're only selling wholesale. But the reality is the wine drinker, the end user, is your actual customer. And when you sell to a wholesaler or a restaurant or a place like that, you lose contact with the wine drinker. If you're a small winery, you're probably at some point in time going to get contacted by Costco, your local Costco, to sell wine in Costco. And this is a very tempting offer because Costco is going to buy quite a bit of your wine and give you a rather big check. The problem is that it's only going to be 5 or 10% above your actual cost for the wine. The trade-off there is that a lot of people, the end user, the drinker, are going to be exposed to your wine because a lot of people buy wine at Costco. Let's be honest, it's cheap. And there's the rub. They're going to be buying your wine at a certain price point that you probably do not want them to be buying your wine at. In other words, in your tasting room, you might be selling that wine for $30. You're going to sell it to Costco for probably $10, and they're going to sell it for $12. So these customers of yours, actually they're Costco's, are going to be buying a wine that they might enjoy, but they're never going to buy it from you retail price because they have now been exposed to the Costco price, which is significantly lower than what you can offer and stay in business. So the Costco distribution model really is left for the bigger wineries, in my opinion, the ones that can actually sell their wine at the same price as Costco and still make money, which is just a volume proposition. You've got to be selling hundreds of thousands of cases to only make 5 or 10% gross profit. So again, the hope is that you agree the target customer for a small winery is the actual wine drinker. So now we have to discuss who is the actual wine drinker, who is the customer. And the more defined you can make your customer, the better off you're going to be in terms of selling to that customer. But let's just break down wine drinkers into two basic categories: those people that have money and those people who know what a good wine actually tastes like. If you have only those two categories, you're going to probably find that people who have a lot of money and know what good wine tastes like are really the target that most small wineries go after, but it's also a very small market. I'm going to estimate maybe 10%. It's probably even less. But maybe 10% of the total wine drinking market are in the high income and high sophistication quadrant, let's say. On the other side, there's probably nobody or a very low percentage of highly sophisticated wine drinkers that have little income. They wouldn't be able to buy good wine if they didn't have enough income. So a majority of wine drinkers fall into the two quadrants of they have money but aren't very sophisticated, or they have money or don't have money and aren't very sophisticated. Probably your target should be, and I'm going to argue that your target should be, those people who have some discretionary income, let's just call them middle income, but aren't very sophisticated, because they're not going to complain about the wine. In other words, they're not out there looking for 90s and buying Wine Spectator. They're not going to be able to tell the difference between a 87 and a 91 or whatever. And quite honestly, the average palate is not very sophisticated and likes a sweeter wine. And one of my favorite marketing wineries, and I'm not going to say the name, but the most winemakers want to make great wine, 93s or whatever. This guy realized that most wine drinkers can't tell the difference, and most wine drinkers prefer a sweeter wine, which most winemakers would say is not actually wine, but it's what most people want. So he intentionally made a sweeter wine and, quite frankly, sold quite a bit of it because he realized, well, the average customer out there wants a sweeter wine. And if you're really trying to sell wine, you're going to give the average customers what they want. even if it hurts your pride in the sense that you're not making a great tasting wine. So you have to kind of decide right from the start, if you're going to own a winery, what is your target customer going to be? Is it going to be the average wine drinker, or are you going to do like most wineries do and try to make a 93 and target the high income people, which is a very, very difficult market to get into because everybody's trying to get those people. And it makes your decisions all the way down to if you have a vineyard, what you're growing and how much you're growing. Most cases in a vineyard, you're stuck growing whatever grapes you have in that area. But in cases where you just have a winery, you can even target a certain varietal and say, well, my area is, middle income. They drink a lot, but they're not very sophisticated, and they like white wines. And so you can buy grapes that fit that demographic. So the more you can narrow down your target drinker, in other words, do they like white? Are they in an area where it's cold in the winter or it's hot in the summer? I mean, the more narrowly defined your customer is, the better off you're going to be and the easier it is to sell to them. But you have to know that before you start making your wine. Another example of this would be if you're targeting a certain level, like maybe you're targeting a little lower income person. They don't care if the bottle's corked. They may not even care if the wine's in a bottle. So those decisions have to be made way early on in order to target those specific customers. But it also goes into what other marketing you do. Your decision making about events and all sorts of things will come down to really identifying who that target customer is. Do you want to be the end drinker of your wine? And again, I would advise you not to pursue the high income, high sophistication drinker. Again, I worked in an area where there were it was a very wealthy area of California, very high sophistication, high income, but every single winery was trying to target those customers, and they just weren't able to do it. There's just not enough people there to sell wine to those people. And the more successful wineries in that area realized, hey, there's other wine drinkers out there. They may not have as much money, but they're not going to be that particular about it. And all you had to do was go into Costco and see how many people were buying wine that was cheaper because they didn't care if it was a 93 or an 87 or it won best of class at this fair or whatever, wine festival or something. So again, it does impact everything, and it's probably the first decision you need to make when you start to produce a certain year and varietal. If you already have wine in your cask that you're fermenting, you're kind of stuck. But as you start to make decisions, the first decision you should be making is, who is going to be the drinker of this particular wine, this particular varietal? How much should it cost them? How much do I want to spend on it? All those things are going to factor in. And if you don't know who the target customer is when you start making your wine, you're going to end up in a situation where you have very expensive wine from a cost perspective and no target customer to sell it to. And that means you're probably not going to be in business for very long. It's important to identify that target customer. And it's important to get as much detail about that, drill down as much as you possibly can. Again, what's the weather like for these customers year round? Do they drink more in hot weather or cold weather? Do they have, some regional things might have more competition than others? The more you can identify what's going on for that customer, the better off you're going to be, with the demographics of an area. For example, there might be a lot of religious non-drinkers in a certain area. Well, that's not going to be a very good target demographic, so you have to consider that. You might have a lot of lower income people in your region or your area where your winery is, and you have to consider that. Do you want to make them your customers, or are you going to target a much smaller demographic in that region? So I worked in Eastern Washington for a little while, not at a winery, but it was considered a wine area. But the demographics of that area were very interesting in that it was very small, high income group, very few middle income, but a lot of low income people. So if you were trying to sell wine there to the local demographic, you had to decide, okay, am I going to target the high income people, or am I going or am I going to go after the low income people? And also, it's like, do I just ignore the local demographic and hopefully use tourism as my target customer and just say, I'm going to trust that the tourist industry here, because it was considered kind of a wine area, they got a lot of people from Seattle and the western side of Washington to come over and go on wine tours. So you could say, I'm going to totally ignore the local demographic and just hope that the tourist industry supports my winery. But again, analyzing every aspect of the every income, the region you're in, the tourist aspect, everything you can know, all the details you can know, put that in there and assess what's going to be my target customer for my wine when I'm done growing it. And that's where you should start making decisions from in terms of, how do I bottle it? Do I use cheaper bottles? Do I even use bottles at all? I mean, what is the customer going to want? One of the terms I like to use for every industry I've ever worked for is managing your customers' expectations. And a lot of that is the business actually can tell the customer, here's what you can expect from our wine. And if you let the customers make the expectations, then you're constantly trying to meet all these different expectations. It's like trying to rent a movie for a family of 5. Everybody wants to watch something different. And if you're reacting to your customers' expectations, some of them they're going to say, I don't want a rosé, I don't want a blend, I don't want white, I don't want red, I don't want to spend $40. And you're going to be jumping through hoops trying to figure out, well, what do we do? What do we do? Whereas if you're, if you're setting the customer's expectations, you can say, okay, here's the price that we're going to have. Here's the quality of wine we're going to sell. And we know who we're selling this to. And we're going to manage those customers' expectations. They're going to expect a certain price. They're going to expect a certain quality, which doesn't have to be the highest quality, but when they come in, they're going to say, I know exactly what I'm buying and it's within my price range. And I, know that this is what I'm going to get for my price. When you can manage your customers' expectations, you're going to be able to sell more wine to them because they're going to be happy with the experience as opposed to constantly being disappointed. That's why you don't want to, if you're a high-end wine, you don't ever want to discount it, because then you're telling your customers, well, it's actually not worth $60 a bottle because we just sold it for $40. So now the customer is going to wait till it's $40 again. So you've just miscommunicated your expectations to your customer, telling them, hey, don't buy wine at the high price, wait till we discount it. So managing customers' expectations has a lot to do with, again, knowing who your customer is and then being able to say, well, here's what our customer wants because we've identified all this detailed information about them. So we know exactly at what price point they want to buy. We know how much wine they drink in a week. We know when they buy wine more frequently than other times when they buy wine, and do your growing or buying of wine accordingly and meet those expectations that you've created for them because you've identified the customer. So in the next podcast, I'll talk more about how to actually get those customers and different strategies that wineries can use. And some of my suggestions are going to be very different than what a normal winery does, but be prepared for some outside of the box thinking, because I think, quite frankly, most wineries need to start thinking outside of the box rather than just doing the straightforward tasting room and wholesale distribution concepts of selling. So thanks.